There are truths in our lives that seem as unshakable as multiplication tables or the laws of physics. The date of the first human spaceflight, our calendar system starting from the birth of Christ, these are the fundamental pillars of our worldview. We see dates on old paintings, in ancient books, on maps yellowed by time, and they serve as beacons lighting our way into the depths of the centuries. They are the foundation of our understanding of the past. But what if we'd been looking at these signs our whole lives without seeing their true meaning? What if, in the very foundation of our chronology, there's a crack big enough to bring down the entire structure of history we've so carefully built? Some researchers are convinced that a whole millennium in human history may have been simply added by scholars in the 15th and 16th centuries. And before you judge this bold idea, let's look at the evidence hiding in plain sight. Here, for example, is a portrait of August Ludwig von Schlosser, one of the creators of the Norman theory of the origin of the Russian state. Beneath his name, the year is listed as 1735. But let's look closer. Instead of the familiar number 1, there is a Latin letter I. Why? Perhaps it's just a misunderstanding, a feature of an old font. But here's another work, an engraved portrait of the famous Italian composer Carlo Broschi, dated 1795. And again, we see the same thing. The capital Latin letter I is neatly separated from the other digits by periods. Let's go further back in time. Before us is an engraving by the great Albrecht Dürer, dated 1524. Here, the first letter is clearly a Latin I, and just like in the previous case, it is set apart by periods on both sides. This was clearly done intentionally, so it wouldn't be mistaken for a number. Could the greatest masters of their era have made the same strange mistake over and over again? Or perhaps it wasn't a mistake at all. On the medieval publisher's mark of Louis Elzevir, the date 1597 is written in Arabic numerals, but here too, the 1 representing 1,000 is rendered as the letter I and separated by a period from the number 597. And here is a work by Hans Baldung Grien, a German Renaissance artist, depicting angels and the crucified Jesus. Here we see that the first digit, representing 1,000, is radically different from the other 2 ones in the date and looks suspiciously like the English letter J. It's perfectly clear that the artist understood the difference between the first symbol of the date and the rest of them.
So, what do these mysterious letters I with a dot or J mean? The most logical and simple explanation is that they are not numbers. They are an abbreviated form of the name Jesus. Depending on the language and tradition, we see either the Greek and Latin I, Isis, or the German, French, or English J, Jesus. And so, the date on the composer Broschi's portrait reads not as 1795, but as in the year of Jesus, 795. This completely changes our perception of time. But if that's true, where did a whole 1,000 years of our history disappear to? It turns out that in some cases, it wasn't just encrypted in this unusual way. Sometimes, it wasn't written at all. And indeed, sometimes it wasn't written at all. Russian imperial cartographers, for example, went even further and seem to have simply dropped the 1,000 from their dates. Why complicate things, right? Take a look at this Russian naval map, published during the reign of Empress Elizabeth Petrovna in the mid-18th century. It clearly states, without any ambiguity, described and measured by decree of Her Imperial Majesty in the year 740 by Fleet Captain Nagaev, composed in the year 750. That's right. The year 750, no thousands, no hidden symbols, an official state document, and the millennium is simply missing. Think this is just a Russian peculiarity? Let's travel to the heart of Europe. Here is a medieval German coat of arms from West Saxony. The dates on it are also written without the first digit. Thus, we read the years 519 and 527 from the birth of Christ. At this point, one might dismiss it. Well, people often make mistakes, they abbreviate, they get lazy. But now we have to argue with an entire nation, the Italians of the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. They named their centuries as if the 1,000 never existed in the date. Just as we now refer to the early years of the 21st century as the 2000s, Italians of the 14th century, that is, those living in the 1400s, called their time simply Quattrocento, which literally means 400s. What thousand? Never heard of it. And this happened with every century. This interesting tradition began with the 1200s, which they called Duecento, that is, the 200s. An entire culture, the cradle of the Renaissance, operated for centuries in daily life and in art with dates from which the first 1,000 years were simply absent. These numerous examples from Russia, Germany, Italy form a single unsettling picture. This no longer looks like random errors or the quirks of individual scribes and engravers. It looks like a system. It seems that up to a certain point in history, people either didn't know about the existence of an extra 1,000 years in the calendar or deliberately omitted it as unnecessary. And this brings up the main question. If so, when did this 1,000 years appear? When and who decided to add it to our calendar, lengthening history by a huge margin? Let's try to find this starting point. Let's try to find the moment when the familiar full 4-digit dates began to appear in documents and on paintings. This search inevitably leads us to a mysterious temporal wall, an invisible boundary that seems almost impossible to look beyond. This search leads us to a clear and tangible boundary, the 15th century. It is here, as if at the flick of an invisible switch, that the dates from the birth of Christ that we are used to seeing begin to appear en masse in European culture. This is a real point of no return. Take, for example, the work of the early Netherlandish painter Jan van Eyck, one of the pillars of the Northern Renaissance. On his famous Arnolfini portrait, if you look closely, you can make out the date the painting was created. On another of his masterpieces, Man in a Red Turban, the date is carved directly onto the frame. The year 1400 is indicated in Roman numerals, and the number 33 in Arabic numerals. On the painting Madonna and Child, we see the inscription 1429. These dates are beyond doubt. They are an integral part of the artworks themselves. And this is not an isolated case. From the 15th century onward, dating becomes the norm. But what came before? What do we find if we take just one step back into the 14th century? And here we hit a brick wall. A great emptiness begins. Try to find original author-signed dates on documents, paintings, or maps from the 13th, 12th, or 11th centuries. It's a nearly impossible task. We find many works that historians attribute to these centuries. For example, here is an old map that scholars date to 1350, and here is another believed to have been created around the mid-14th century. But why? There are no indications of the year of their creation on the artifacts themselves. For some reason, medieval masters didn't bother to sign their work with a date.
The same is true for paintings and texts. We can search for hours, but we can hardly find any original records of creation dates on documents before the 15th century. They are either missing or have been carefully cut out or erased. Mainstream science offers us several explanations. First, God-fearing Christians did not like to advertise their names and dates, considering it a manifestation of pride. But wait, not signing your name is one thing, but what does the date have to do with it? A date records an event in time. It doesn't glorify the author. The second explanation, in the Middle Ages, writing materials like expensive parchment were often saved, and old records were simply erased to write new ones. But again, a question arises. Why were the dates destroyed with such persistence? And why did this practice completely stop in the 15th century? Perhaps they will tell us that people of that time were not so concerned with precise chronology. But is it believable that for centuries, no ruler, chronicler, scholar, or merchant was interested in when exactly an important treaty was signed, a chronicle was written, or a work of art was created? This contradicts the very logic of civilization's development. This dark timelessness, this strange void, suggests that it's not about the modesty of masters or saving parchment. Perhaps these hundreds of years, devoid of their own dates, were not just dark. Perhaps they were artificially inserted into the chronology later. What if we remove this 1,000-year bubble, which seems to be filled with nothing but the guesswork of historians? If we do that, the scattered fragments of the past begin to form a much more coherent and logical picture. This brick wall, this chronological void, raises the question, what if we are trying to find something that never existed? And then a bold but logical idea emerges, most fully articulated by the mathematician Anatole Fomenko and his colleagues. What if there was no 1,000-year gap between so-called antiquity and the Renaissance? What if the great events of ancient Rome, ancient Greece, and the European Middle Ages happened much closer to each other in time, and perhaps were even part of the same historical era that was later artificially divided and stretched out on the calendar?
If we accept this hypothesis, the logic of the empty centuries becomes crystal clear. Imagine the official version of history. After the fall of Rome, Europe plunges into the so-called Dark Ages. For more than 1,000 years, development seems to freeze. One gets the distinct impression that all this time, Europe, and Russia too, did nothing but create from the same template, producing almost no new genres. More than 1,000 years during which humanity seems to be treading water, endlessly copying the same ancient and biblical subjects. Often, according to official dating, even more primitive works of art were created than those that came before them. And after this 1,000-year cultural sleep, suddenly, as if on command, an explosion occurs, the Renaissance arrives, and human genius begins to create again. Such a picture looks extremely implausible. Any system, any civilization, either develops or declines, but it cannot remain in a 1,000-year state of suspended animation. But if we assume that this 1,000 years did not exist, everything falls into place. The ancient models were not copied for 1,000 years. They were the living heritage for the masters of the Middle Ages, who were their immediate successors, not distant descendants. And this sudden explosion of the Renaissance is not a miracle, but a natural stage of cultural development that was not interrupted for a millennium. If we mentally collapse time, removing this artificial bubble, we get a complete, event-filled picture where there is no room for stagnation, but continuous movement, revolutions, reforms, intrigues, and wars. Evidence that history was literally stretched by hand can be found in the works of chronologists of the past. Look at the chronological table of Pierre Duval, created in the 17th century. It clearly shows that European scholars of that time for a long time simply did not know what to insert into the first centuries of our era, leaving empty spaces there. And in more ancient epochs, they made completely absurd mistakes. For example, the biblical patriarch Abraham, who was considered a contemporary of the Assyrian king Ninus and his wife Semiramis, was shifted by them into deep antiquity by another 1,000 years from the era of those with whom he lived. Historians of the 17th and 18th centuries were so carried away with aging the facts of the recent past that they even began to attribute a 4,000-year history to the peoples of medieval Tartary. If the fabric of history was artificially and so crudely stretched, then its writing must have inevitably left traces of this process, some kind of seams, folds, and duplicates. And such duplicates do exist in huge numbers. In official history, they are known as incredible coincidences. But what if they are not coincidences at all?
And indeed, if the fabric of history was artificially stretched, then these seams and duplicates appear before us in all their glory. In official chronology, they are called amazing coincidences, but on closer inspection, they look more like glitches in the matrix, like proof that the past was copied and pasted into different eras. Let's consider one of the most striking and relatively recent examples, the story of the two Napoleons, the first and the third. Their biographies look like a historical echo, like two lives lived according to the same script, with a difference of exactly 50 years. Both were artillery officers. Both came to power in France as a result of coup d'etat. Both suppressed uprisings, including in Ireland. Both waged wars in Turkey. And, most strikingly, even the fates of their sons developed in parallel. They were born and died with the same 50-year difference. Can one believe in so many coincidences? Researchers who have studied this issue have counted dozens of similar duplicate personalities and events, but the story of the Napoleons is just the tip of the iceberg. There is a much larger phenomenon, which has been called the Catherine shift. According to this theory, the history of ancient Rome as we know it from textbooks and the history of Russia in the 15th to 17th centuries coincide in the smallest details with a constant chronological shift of 1168 years. They are as similar as two cars of the same series produced by the same factory, albeit with a huge time gap. This parallelism is so precise that it seems as if chroniclers of different eras were working from the same manual. As soon as a Roman author mentions, for example, a war with a certain people, his Russian colleague, as if responding to a call across a millennium, invariably places the report of a successful campaign in his chronicle exactly 1168 years later. Thus, Stenka Razin's campaign in Persia turns out to be a surprisingly accurate reflection of one of the wars described in ancient Roman sources. What does all this mean? We are faced with the effect of historical déjà vu. A hypothesis arises that the history we know may not be a unique sequence of events, but a multiple, phantom reflection of the same real incidents. Imagine that the same event was recorded by different chroniclers in different countries and in different languages. Centuries later, when future historians began to collect these scattered chronicles, they did not realize that they were reading about the same thing. They took these records for descriptions of different but similar events and, finding no place for them in their era, simply placed them in the empty centuries of the past, thus creating phantom dynasties and entire duplicate empires.
These glitches in the matrix,
These astonishing duplicates are not just historical curiosities for puzzle lovers. They indicate that history was not just accidentally lengthened, but purposefully and methodically rewritten. And if that is the case, the main question remains, perhaps the most important question for understanding our past and present. Who had the power, the resources, and most importantly, the motive to carry out such a grandiose falsification? Why would anyone need to create this extra 1,000 years? Let's pause for a moment and look at the path we've traveled. Our investigation began with a single strange detail: the Latin letter I on old engravings disguised as a number. This led us to documents where an entire millennium was simply missing, as if it never existed. We saw how an entire nation during the Renaissance spoke of its time by subtracting 1,000 years. We hit a brick wall at the 15th century, beyond which almost all author-signed dates disappear. And finally, we encountered shocking glitches in the matrix, historical duplicates, and entire phantom empires that make us doubt the linearity and uniqueness of historical events. All this evidence, taken together, paints a picture that is strikingly different from the one in the textbooks. We have gathered enough evidence to at least doubt the official version. So who benefited from creating an ancient history? Who won the grand prize from this great deception? The answer should be sought where power is concentrated. Imagine Europe in the 15th and 16th centuries. This was a time of forming strong, centralized states, a time when young monarchies desperately needed legitimacy. What could be better proof of the right to the throne than an ancient lineage? By creating and extending history, one could prove that the ruling dynasty descended from the great emperors of antiquity or legendary heroes of the past. Such fabricated antiquity gave power a sacred, almost divine status, making it indisputable in the eyes of the subjects. And who had the necessary resources for this? Who controlled the creation and copying of texts? Who held the keys to education and knowledge? The answer is obvious: the Church. Why would the Vatican and other religious centers need to lengthen the chronology from the birth of Christ? Perhaps to prove the antiquity of their own power and the immutability of their dogmas. By stretching history, it was possible to create the Dark Ages, a period in which the Church appeared as the sole guardian of knowledge and civilization. The longer and more ancient the history, the stronger its foundation, the more legitimate its claims to spiritual and sometimes secular dominion over the world. The political and religious elites of that time probably worked together, creating a version of the past that was convenient for everyone. However, we cannot give a final and 100% certain answer. Our goal is not to impose a new truth, but to show that the established worldview can be an illusion. Official history is not a frozen fact, not an exact science. It is a version, a story written by people, and people, as we know, are made of flesh and blood. They could have made genuine mistakes, misinterpreting ancient sources. They could have lied, following the order of their ruler. Or they could have deliberately hidden something, creating a more convenient and advantageous past for themselves. Therefore, you should not take any version at its word, including this one. The main conclusion from our investigation is a call to think critically. Ask questions, compare facts, look for inconsistencies, and do not be afraid to doubt what seems obvious. The past is not a closed book that just needs to be read. It is a vast field for research, full of secrets and mysteries. And it is quite possible that the biggest secret in human history is still waiting for its moment, and for someone who dares to look beyond the official page.